is going on in society? When has all of this kind of become a thing? That if you've got a political opponent, so someone that you disagree with, which is absolutely fine in a democracy, all views welcome and all that. But what happened? What triggered? What changed? I don't know, because it doesn't feel like it always used to happen. It feels like it's a relatively recent thing. And what I'm describing is people basically suggesting that their political opponents are somehow akin to Nazis. Seems to happen left, right and centre now. It's almost becoming boring because it's happening that often. But today's latest example of it, someone very senior, the Attorney General, Lord Hermer, he's had to express regret. His choice of words, let's listen then, shall we, to his choice of words.
Approach is a rejection of the siren song that can sadly now be heard in the Palace of Westminster and in some sections of the media, that Britain must abandon the constraints of international law in favour of raw power. Now, this is not a new song. The claim that international law is fine as far as it goes, but can be put aside when conditions change, is a claim that was made in the early 1930s by realist jurists in Germany, most notably Carl Schmitt, whose central thesis was, in essence, the claim that state power is all that counts, not law.
He subsequently gone on to say, basically, that he regrets the clumsy choice of words. They were not clumsy chosen words. They were prepared, scripted, deliberately chosen words. What do you make to this, Matt Goodwin?
Well, they were deliberately chosen. Carl Schmitt was notorious for being aligned to the German Nazis, so the Attorney General knew exactly what he was doing, much like David Lammy knew what he was doing when he compared the pro-Brexit ERG group to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. What we've seen this week, both with this statement and Keir Starmer's speech in Northern England attacking Nigel Farage, is the beginning of Project Fear 2.0, a view that if you vote for Farage and reform, you are voting for the apocalypse. You are voting for the return of Nazism, economic collapse, doom and gloom. And this is essentially all the left have now. They don't have a response to the legitimate concerns people have. Well, why can't we control our borders so long as we're in the ECHR? Why can't we deport foreign nationals so long as we're in the ECHR? They don't have answers to this. All they have is, well, you're a Nazi if you disagree. The roof is going to cave in. We're going to have, World War III. That was the argument before the vote for Brexit. And now we have this hysteria. I think the elite class, as represented by the Attorney General, have lost the plot. I think everybody watching this will know that they've lost the plot.
Do you guys at home get called Nazis? Has it ever happened to you? Honestly, you might laugh, Jonathan. Have you ever been called a Nazi?
No.
I get called it. I lose count how many times people on social media sling that accusation at me, fascist, Nazi, because of I performed the horrendous crime of wishing to have controlled borders.
Well, I think I don't know exactly what you've been saying, but I presume you haven't said anything that would merit that attack. It's an incredibly... It's a very dangerous thing to call someone. If you call someone a Nazi, obviously the Nazis are responsible for one of the great, single most horrendous atrocities in modern history, or indeed any history. So it cheapens that immensely when you use it when it's not justified. He didn't say that Farage was a Nazi, and he didn't say that.
No, he's way too clever for that. He's not going to write in the script, Nigel Farage is a Nazi.
He didn't say the people who want to leave the ECHR are Nazis either. What he was saying, and I agree that it was a clumsy phrase, but what he was pointing out was that there is a very good reason why the international community built organisations and institutions after the Second World War. And that is because we need to have some kind of shared framework for dealing with shared problems. So that's why we have United Nations, for example. We know, obviously, the League of Nations was a terrible failure before the Second World War. It helped to create the Second World War and cause the Second World War. So we need strong institutions where, yes, you do indeed pool some sovereignty to address the challenges we have. That's why we have something called international law.
Jonathan, can I ask you a question? Do you think New Zealand is a Nazi state? Canada, Australia, they're all Anglo nations that are not in the ECHR.
Matt, you're desperate. I know that you're desperate to have an argument with me.
No, I'm saying they're not in the ECHR.
Clearly, they are. I mean, I don't even need to dignify that question with a response. I am not saying I'm not saying that if you want to leave the ECHR, you are a Nazi either. I thought I'd made that quite clear in
what
my
you're saying
remarks.
Is that if we reject the multilateral rule, multilateral world order, international rules and conventions, and this is what the Attorney General was saying, we are somehow, at least let's agree, he said you're equivalent to 1930s Germany, where people prioritise state power over international laws, right? That's essentially what he said. Now, there are lots of countries around the world today. Iceland rejecting international laws on fishing.
Iceland's in the ECHR.
But has rejected the ICJ ruling on fishing. European countries saying they want to modify the ECHR. New Zealand, Canada not being in the ECHR. And the narrative you get from the left all the time is, well, Winston Churchill created this, therefore what's your problem with it? When the ECHR was established, it was an entirely different body of text from what it is now today. And this is what the Attorney General, Keir Starmer, and other international lawyers they're not being honest with people about that. It's morphed into an activist, politicised, biased international convention that stops us from controlling our borders.
The fundamental principle of it is unchanged from the last 75 years.
No,
it is
not true.
It's fundamentally designed to sort of embed a set of rights and principles that all signatory states abide by, and we know that only 2 states have ever left the ECHR. Belarus and Russia,
and there are many more that are not in the ECHR,
which are not we're not, I would argue, examples that we should be following. It does not follow, and I know you're desperate for me to say that you're a Nazi.
No, I think you're gaslighting a lot of people.
Well, so I can't win then. If I say that you're a Nazi, I'm
not
the wrong. If I say you're
desperate for you to say I'm a Nazi. Where's that come from?
I'm not saying you're desperate. I'm saying Matt.
Oh, right.
I don't believe that if you want to leave the ECHR, you're a Nazi. I believe that you're wrong, and we can have that discussion. So I thought I'm making my... How am I gaslighting?
What we've seen... Let me clarify, because what you're saying is the only 2 countries that have left the ECHR are Belarus and Russia. Right, but what you should be saying, if you were being accurate with people watching, is you should say the only 2 countries that have left are Russia and Belarus, but many other countries around the world
have not joined
the ECHR.
They're not in Europe.
There are lots of countries outside of Europe who are part and subscribe to the ECHR.
Well,
so anyway, but that being said,
the ECHR, there's a rubric for who is allowed to join. I think you have to be in the sort of the certain partnership countries, and pretty much everyone who could be in it is in it.
What we've seen with the Attorney General's comments is the same that we saw with people saying Trump voters were deplorables, Brexit voters were gammons, pro-Brexit voices in the House of Commons were equivalent to the Nazis, UKIP voters were cranks and loonies and racists, according to David Cameron. And what Starmer and Hermer don't understand is this is going to add to people's anger and frustration with an elite class in Westminster that is not listening to the mood in the country. And what people out there are saying is, do whatever you need to do to stop the boats and control our borders.
Matt, this is so silly. It's completely legitimate to point out the genesis of international law, which was the colossal failure of international institutions and law that culminated in the Second World War and the horrors. And after that, which you will freely admit, you just have admitted, people like Winston Churchill came together with his European colleagues to set up a convention on human rights and a court which was there to adjudicate on human rights disputes. Now, that is just a fact, and that it came out of the ashes of the Second World War.
Yes.
Now, I agree that it might have
changed since then, hasn't it, monumentally?
As I just said, it might have changed. It's legitimate to argue that we should try and change a relationship or that we should leave altogether. I would never agree with that, but it's completely legitimate to argue with it. I would never call you a Nazi.
Okay, so if you won't leave it, how do you solve... You would accept then, if you do not leave the ECHR, you cannot solve the small boat crisis.
I don't believe that's true, by the way. And can I also just point out this conversation is quite interesting because we hear so often about snowflakery on the left, about how people on the left are always getting offended by the slightest thing. I think that you're just demonstrating the exact same thing on the other side. That someone makes a comment, which is historical, that this court, this institution, was born out of the ashes of the Second World War, and to point out that it was a Nazi who said that sort of state power was all that counted, not international law. Again, just a fact. And you're saying, he was saying that we're all Nazis. we're not Nazis.
That's not what I'm objecting to. He could have chosen any political philosopher to make that point. He didn't need to choose Carl Schmitt. That's number one. Everyone knows Carl Schmitt was aligned with Hitler and the Nazis. Point two, he has not mentioned in his lecture that many states since the Second World War have chosen not to participate in international law. In the mind of the Attorney General, like in the mind of Keir Starmer, in the mind of these people on the left, if you question international law and convention, you are somehow comparable. Well, don't forget, sorry, Jonathan, it was only a few months ago that Keir Starmer was running up and down this country saying that if anybody questioned his government's policies on migration and the borders, they were somehow equivalent to the far right.
No. That's all. Again, why can't you just critique people based on what they say?
That is literally what he said. Followed by, if you care about the rape gangs in this country, you are participating in a far right narrative.
Say that. He did not say that anyone who was concerned about migration or anything like that was far right. He was saying accurately that the far right was jumping on a bandwagon after Southport, which they obviously did, and the people were following it.
Which the police have since concluded was not the case. I'm sure you've read the latest police report into the Southport riots and protests, and what does it conclude? There was no organised far-right presence in the riots or the protests. I'm sure you've read that.
Well, the riots were a result of far-right misinformation.
No, I'm sorry.
Well, it was clearly it was misinformation because it wasn't a failed asylum.
So this is a problem in politics today. You get a lot of people who aren't even reading the research and the evidence. The police report has...
People were not rioting because there was a young black British man who'd done this. That was not the reason they were doing it.
They were being whipped up by the far right. Do I believe Jonathan Liss or do I believe a report by the police federation?
There was misinformation on the internet.
Created partly by Keir Starmer.
Well, that's a separate argument. There was misinformation on the internet about the identity of the culprit. This is something that, surely you're not disputing that.
Jonathan, you're painting
There was misinformation everywhere, and I can also remember a lot of misinformation, actually, that was also taking place at the time of this civil unrest, which was suggesting that white British men were acid attacking Muslim women. I remember that taking place at the time, and those suggestions were driving, I would argue, was driving a lot of young Muslim men to the streets to try and hunt out people to retaliate against. I also realised that no action was taken against the people that were suggesting and making up those false rumours on social media. Anyway, look, what do you make to it all? Lots that we need to discuss. I'll bring you into the conversation, worry not, because I can hear you shouting at your screens. I've got to say, as I've already said to you, Lord Hermer basically defended his speech. He said that he used clumsy language, and I also have to say as well, he rejects the way that he says the Tories are characterising his speech, and Keir Starmer apparently still has full confidence in the Attorney General. There you go. Make of it all what you will.